Roman Sidorov was one of the most unique musicians of the post-Soviet Russia. I would even say he was one of the most unusual artists in the history of Russian music. I'm not exaggerating, I truly mean it, and think he deserved to be described in such kind of way. His persona became very influential in the Russian underground scene that still keeps inspiring the newer generations of musicians. Unfortunately, Roman's got such a cult status posthumously, but the interest about him, his biography, and his music doesn't fade. Even recently, from time to time, the new facts about him are being discovered. In this podcast, I'll tell you about the biography and music of that outstanding artist. Lots of the facts about him I learned from different articles and the interviews from people who worked with him and knew him personally. If you're interested, I'll leave all links in the description. It's gonna be surprising to some people, but while trying to find out anything about Roman's early years, I had two very long phone conversations with Evgeny Solovyov, who knew Roman since 1995, who worked with him on his first projects, Bardcore and Fatal. It's in Evgeny's basement Der Golem's first album was recorded, so he witnessed how it was done. He also spent lots of time with Roman beyond music, so he told me so many things that has never been on the internet. I wanna say thanks a lot to him for being so enthusiastic about helping me with a podcast. If you're a foreign fan of Roman's music and you always wanted to know something about him, take a glass of milk, some sandwiches and a bunch of cookies. Sit down comfortably on a couch because your prayer had been heard. You're about to hear facts that even some Russian fans don't know. But firstly, before I start telling you about Roman, I need to tell you about the town where he lived, Fryazino, because it's very important. Fryazino is the town nearby Moscow. After the World War II, the USSR government decided to bring lots of German scientists and engineers to Fryazino. That's why, since then, people of the town had much better access to different kinds of technologies than many other places in Russia. After the fall of USSR, the censorship in Russia had weakened its grip, so lots of different things from abroad became accessible. People could easily buy different occult and extremist books such as Carlos Castaneda, Aleister Crowley. Even Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler could be found somewhere in a metro or a market. Same situation was about music. You could purchase many different underground albums in the places where you wouldn't expect to see them. Such things as Dead in June, Soviet France, Muslim Gauze, Burzum, Current 93, Nurse with Wound, etc. But there was the dark side of it all, the drugs. People started massively using drugs when they flooded post-Soviet Russia. Also, without censorship, lots of different religious sects and extremist political organizations started spreading like a virus in Russia. Of course, all of that affected Russian people then, and the town of Fryazino wasn't an exception. Surprising fact is that in Fryazino there are lots of different musicians who became known in some specific circles of people, and Roman Sidorov was one of those musicians. Roman Sidorov was born in the February 6th of 1974. There is not much known about his childhood or teenage period. What is known is that he studied in one of the Fryazino schools. He was a bad student. Also, he drank vodka and hated everyone there, including his teachers. After school, he went to the local technical college. He still didn't care about the studies, and the only things he did there was making music and drinking vodka with his friends. There, he met Dmitry Medenkov, who later will become known as Mitya Zubov. Roman and Mitya became very good friends, and they made lots of different music together. That will make them famous in the future. They were very close friends. When they met, they always had a very dark sense of humor, and they enjoyed fucking with people. They always told such kind of jokes that are still making people who knew them both laugh. They even had their own sly scheme how to get the music cassettes from the naive dealers for free. After the university, Roman got a job. He, according to Evgeny's words, wanted a job where he could contribute the least amount of efforts possible. He then worked in one of the Moscow theaters and was responsible for the inventory and screwed in the light bulbs. That's the way his lifestyle was. He could rent a room in someone's apartment. He was eating the cheapest food he could possibly find, and he was absolutely okay about it. What about his personal life then? Well, he was pretty popular among women, but he didn't like them because he always talked an awful stuff about them. What did he think about the town where he lived? I think his own opinion about Fryazina, it's kind of interesting. Evgeny told me one story that happened between him and Roman. When Evgeny and Roman walked around the streets when it was already dark. Roman was noisy and shouted different not so nice things. Evgeny asked him to calm down before they drew the attention of random assholes who could want to hurt them. And this is what Roman answered to him. Evgeny, this is the ghetto town. You must be loud and aggressive. If you behave quiet as you offer, someone totally will come to hurt you. That's why you must act and look as tough as possible. Well, how did he become interested in music? You might ask. Roman, like many other Russian musicians in those times, after getting different music in his hands, became enthusiastic about creating something his own. Uh, the moment when he started liking music when he had heard the song The Chauffeur by Duran Duran. He didn't have any other hobbies besides music. One of the things that he did regularly was drugs. I also would like to add that he never had any specific political or religious views because he thought that politics and religion made people dumb. Even in the early and middle 90s, he wasn't into the music that made him famous yet. Then he was into metal. He enjoyed death metal, black metal, grindcore, and stuff like that. During the period when he listened to metal, he used heroin. Later, he lost interest in metal and started going deeper into experimental electronic music genres such as industrial. First of all, you need to know what Roman did music for. Maybe it will be disappointing for some people, but the main purpose was popularity. Of course, like many other musicians, Roman did it because he liked it, but at the same time he wanted to become very popular, and he didn't care in which specific genre he wanted to get recognized. He also didn't like the local underground music scene and didn't want to have anything to do with them. I think his own words will explain it in a much better way. I want to become so popular that I don't even need to take a shit next to those post-punk bands. He was a very ambitious individual, unlike his first music project. In the early 90s, the band called Bardcore was organized. During its brief existence, the band had two lineups. The first lineup was Roman Sidorov, Mitya Zubov, and Artyom Grechko. Bardcore was a parody band that intended to be a failure. All of the three members of the band wanted to create something that would make people feel disgusted. It was a primitive music accompanied by the provocative lyrics that were full of slang and different vulgar themes such as masturbation, sex, perversions, menstruations, street violence, etc. Conceptually, the main character of the Bardcore songs was an overage redneck from Fryazino, whose interests were to eat, drink some booze, get high, and fuck. In 1993, they recorded their first demo. Interesting fact, until the demo suddenly appeared on the internet many years later, everyone thought it was lost because Roman had a habit to destroy most of his works. In 1995, Roman Sidorov and Mitya Zubov met Evgeny Solovyov, and then they all together organized the recording studio in Evgeny's basement. After that, they began trying to make music together. In the beginning, they started a Noise Live project. There was the moment when each of them took something heavy in their hands, turned on Skinny Puppy's music, and started breaking down the ventilation ducts in the place where they recorded. They broke down everything. The result of those attempts was the second Bardcore's lineup and the second demo that was recorded in the late 90s. The second demo was much longer and more melodic than the first one. Bardcore even performed live once. It was in 1996 in the school where Roman once studied. Roman Sidorov and Evgeny Solovyov performed it together without getting Mitya involved. They didn't invite him because at that time he had absolutely deserved nickname Righteous, so they did it to avoid any kind of incidents. It wasn't their own music. Then they covered the song "Million of the Scarlet Roses" by the Soviet singer Alla Pugacheva. When they performed, Evgeny played the guitar and sang, and Roman was the second vocalist. Roman read the lyrics from the paper while singing because he couldn't remember it. In its discography, Bardcore had only two untitled demo tapes that were recorded between 1993 and 1996, but Evgeny also mentioned that he has another Bardcore tape that was never released on the internet. I honestly didn't listen to the full tapes because some songs weren't available on the internet, so I don't want to discuss each of the demo tapes for too long. I just would like to say that I had some fun while listening to Bardcore. It felt kind of awkward though. Bardcore had neither an artistic nor a cultural value. The band members themselves didn't take it seriously, so it broke up pretty quickly in the beginning of the late 90s. It was 1998. Even though Bardcore broke up, Roman and Evgeny decided to keep working together. They didn't have any material yet for the new project, so they started making the first steps in recording. They made a few sessions where usually Evgeny played something and Roman told if it was good or not. Roman was very knowledgeable about music, so Evgeny trusted his taste. At those times, they thought that two members weren't enough for recording and performing music, so they decided to seek for more band members. Roman and Yevgeny made an advertisement in the Zigzag magazine. Once, Roman saw an advertisement from someone else where it was written, "If you play any industrial, gothic, dark wave kind of music, you can call and I'll organize a concert for you in the Reactor nightclub." Roman decided to call and told to the person on the other end of the phone that he is playing that kind of music that was written in the ad. He just had a problem about his band not having enough members. After that, Roman arranged a meeting with that guy. Roman told him that he can be identified by the short vertical ponytail on his head. When both arrived to the place of the meeting, that guy could quickly find Roman. Roman wore an orange jacket and he really had a short vertical ponytail on his head. The guy with whom Roman met was a musician either. They met at the place after his performance with a band where he was a session musician. He immediately apologized to Roman for that lame stuff that he was playing there, and Roman told it's okay, somewhere it was even good. When they met, they had a conversation where Roman offered him to play music together, and the guy enthusiastically agreed. At the end of the conversation, Roman gave him some cassettes with different music. There were electronic records made by Evgeny Solovyov and some songs by Bardcore. The first he didn't find interesting, but he liked the latter. The name of that guy who Roman met was Evgeny Varanovsky. He was only 18 then, and together with him and Evgeny Solovyov, they made the project Fatal. Before telling you about Fatal, I'd like to make one thing clear. I know that in English it's actually Fatal, but because all three members always called it Fatal, I'll call it this way to keep it authentic. Firstly, who and why created the band name? The name Fatal was made by Roman because this word remains the same in all languages. They all were very well aware of the different electronic and rave cultures, but eventually they decided to make trip hop. They didn't create much while working together. They did only 2 sessions where they recorded just 4 songs. When I listened to all of those songs, I truly enjoyed them. It was very calming and trippy music. I liked the melodies, the atmosphere, and how Roman's vocals were laying over the instrumentals. As the first attempt to create something serious, it was very successful. During those sessions, Evgeny Solovyov was filming the process on his camera. He told me on the phone that he had a 30-minute footage, but unfortunately most of it was damaged while he tried to convert it from NTSC to FAL format. So only a few short clips survived and they are still available on the internet. Sometimes, besides music, they visited concerts together. One of the most memorable concerts of that time was the live performance of the Japanese noise project, Government Alpha. It was the first noise project in Russia that pushed Russian underground scene towards noise genre. Roman and Evgeny Varanovsky had been there. It might be surprising, but Roman had not just seen it, but participated in the performance as well. Yasutoshi Yoshida, the Government Alpha leader, gave the microphone to Roman and let him scream something into it, and it was laced in during the entire concert. There is no footage of it available on the internet. For the one short moment, Evgeny Varanovsky and his friend took the microphone from Roman because they felt jealous. They did it to scream something there as well. Roman took it personally, so after the concert, he told to Evgeny that it's not good to take the microphone from the vocalist. At that concert, he also first time met his future wife, Alia, but I'll tell you more about her later. Mm, Well, after some time, Roman, Evgeny Varanovsky, and Evgeny Solovyov watched together the footage from that concert. Solovyov filmed that moment on his camera, and you can watch it on the internet. Fatal was Fatal was active for a very short amount of time. The thing is that the relationships between the band members weren't so friendly. The first problem started when they tried to promote their materials. When they tried to send it to different people so their songs could be included into compilation albums, nobody liked Roman's vocals. Even the band members didn't like it, to be honest. Roman wasn't responsible either, because when he was in Moscow, he was asked to send the music for promotion, and he refused to do it just because he didn't want to. As you see, all of the problems were about him. Even as a band member, he didn't do much for the band. Besides being a mediocre vocalist then, he neither played any instruments nor wrote his own lyrics. All of the lyrics were selected from different Russian poems of the Silver Age. He wasn't even managing the band well because he often came to the recording sessions when he was on drugs. Maybe he at least tried to maintain the moral state of the band? Not one bit. Once upon a time, Solovyov and Varanovsky met together and they told to each other what Roman thought of them when they weren't nearby. Yes, he was talking shit about them behind their backs. Both members of the band got very pissed off and decided to fire Roman. When Roman left the band, Fatal still was active for a very short amount of time. They tried to make a band with a female vocalist. They decided to rename the band as Eraserhead, like David Lynch's first film. It didn't work out because the new vocalist was a jazz singer and she didn't understand how to keep minimalistic and wasn't into trip hop music at all. What about Roman? Roman indeed got extremely offended by that situation because he was very self-centered and thought of them as mere musicians in his band. From his point of view, it looked like they threw him away from his own band, so he saw it as a backstabbing betrayal. After the band's breakup, he still kept in touch with them from time to time, but even years later he couldn't let it go. Roman was very distressed after being kicked out. Once he went to his good friend and a fellow musician, Yuri Zvyzdny, and complained about what happened. Also, Roman told him that he wanted to make a new band. In the year 1999, not so long after Fatal broke up, Roman met Evgeny Varanovsky and told him about how upset he was. Especially he was disappointed about Evgeny Solovyov because Roman started it with him. Evgeny Varanovsky offered him to try something together, and after that they made some demos that are recently known under the project title Sacrificum Intellectus. Later, Roman and Mitya Zubov decided to unite their efforts again to make the project that will make them famous. The project was called Der Golem. Obviously, the name was inspired by Gustav Meyring's book with the same title. Roman also said that Der to make it sound foreign and Golem to make it sound scary. Their first album Zmed was recorded in 1999 in Podval Records that was located in the basement of the House of Children's Art. If previously Roman didn't do anything but vocals, in Der Golem he actually started playing instruments. Roman was responsible for vocals, electronics and a guitar. Mitya Zubov recorded synthesizers and drums. There was also the third participant in the lineup, being one Pavel D, who did electronics for the songs number 2 and 8. While recording one of the songs for the album, Evgeny Varanovsky paid them a visit. People weren't glad to see him because they thought he wanted to listen and take some ideas for himself, although he never had intentions like that. Once when Varanovsky made the album Landschaft by his solo project Cispinitum, he showed it to Roman and his friends during one of his visits. They kind of liked it, but Roman said, and we have our own project, Der Golem. Roman was a very vindictive person. When the album was ready, Roman paid a sudden visit to Varanovsky when he rehearsed the performance in the theater. Roman called him by the phone and asked him to go out for a meeting. When Evgeny went out and he saw Roman, he looked differently from what he looked like during the Fatal period. At that moment, Roman wore a khaki jacket and resembled of Douglas Pierce of Death in June. Roman gave a copy of the cassette with Zmet album and asked Varanovsky to give it to the right hands. Evgeny asked him to make sure. To which hands? Give it to the goths, Roman answered. Then Roman and Evgeny stood there for some time in the awkward silence. Then Roman left in an unknown direction, and Evgeny came back to the theater. When Evgeny came home, he turned on the cassette. He felt so excited while listening, he thought it's a really great record. Later, Evgeny gave the cassette to some people who liked it either and organized one concert for Der Golem. During Der Golem's activity, the band performed live about 2 or 3 times. Roman thought that Der Golem must perform rarely and only for a very narrow circle of people. People who attended the Der Golem's concert felt a very deep and stunning atmosphere that the band was radiating. On one of the concerts, there was Alia, Roman's future wife. The first time she saw him was when he performed with Government Alpha in 1998. When she saw him again performing with Der Golem, she was charmed. After that, Roman and Alia started being more often together. After one of the concerts, Roman had nowhere to go for a sleepover. Evgeny Solovyov offered him to stay at his home. Also, after being impressed by Der Golem, he offered him his help about music if he needed any. Roman reacted on that with such a cringed face and said, "I'll sleep at your place, but I'll never work with you again because you betrayed me." After that, he was silent. I also must mention the only Der Golem's live performance that was filmed. It was the live performance in the forest that was done in the June 6th of 1999. The lineup there was slightly different. Roman Sidorov, vocals and percussion. Mitya Zubov, Polyvox synthesizer. Alexander Nichetaev, guitar. Just to let you know that Alexander was just a live session guitarist. He had nothing to do with the album recording process. The place where they performed wasn't really a forest, it was more like a field. Evgeny Solovyov didn't show up there, but Der Golem somehow used his equipment without his permission. I watched that footage of them performing so many times already. It's one of my favorite live videos that I've ever seen. That video will let you understand and feel how great they were live. Well, time to talk about Zmet. Finally, the first album review for such a long time. I began learning about Roman Sidorov's music from this album back in late 2018. I was just watching stuff on YouTube and then suddenly I spotted the song Нет. I listened to it and it blew my mind then. I've already heard lots of post-punk and dark wave songs, but I've never heard anything like that. I was very surprised to hear something that sounded so unique. When the song just started, it already felt special. It was so impressive that after a short amount of time I decided to listen to Zmed, and each song from there was so awesome. Since then I started listening to Roman Sidorov's music pretty regularly. I listened to Zmed at the second time in 2020 when I decided to go through Roman's full discography. Some interesting facts about the album. The band's most famous song, Нет, sounds quite differently from the rest of the tracklist. It's because this song was intended to be for Fatal, but because Fatal was broken up, Roman added this song for their Golems album. In the beginning, the song title was Auf Wiedersehen Madame, but later it was renamed. In the early 2018, one disgusting incident happened in Russia that gave the song Нет some infamy. One Russian student brutally killed his ex-girlfriend, raped her dead body, and then committed suicide. In his suicide note, he asked to play the song Нет on his funeral. The lyrics from the album were mostly original, except for those on the punk songs. It's the song number 7. For this song, Roman used Aleister Crowley's poem, Hymn to Punk. Also, the lyrics for the song Нет also contained parts from the poetry by the classic Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva. I think it's the exact time to discuss their second album, that they recorded not so long after the first album. The album was called Disciplina Взорванных мостов, what stands for the Blown Up Bridges Discipline. It was released in the year 2000. The album doesn't have an official album cover. The first time it was issued, it was released as a limited edition of 33 copies. It was a cassette in a small brown and blue box. Besides the cassette, there were paper with a track list and a person on whose label it was issued. There also was a test tube with a ground from the local 16th century graveyard inside the box. They just went to that graveyard, took some ground from there in the plastic bag, and then when they returned home, they put it into the 33 test tubes for each copy. The Blown Up Bridges Discipline was a very weird album. Firstly, because it's unclear who did what for the album. The creating process was so messed up that it's even hard to say or find out how it was made. What is known for sure is that the album was mostly recorded by Roman at his friends' homes. Mostly he recorded alone at Andrei Ivanov's home. He is the author of the noise project Misery. He was Roman's good friend who also once performed as Misery together with their Golem. Roman often paid him a visit and together they could talk about different things for hours. Roman lived at his apartment while recording their Golem's second album. Even when Andrei left somewhere, Roman stayed at his home and worked on the album. On his label, Linia Shuma, the line of noise, their Golem's second album was released. Evgeny Solovyov told me that there are two versions of the album, the analog one and the digital one. The digital one is recently available on the internet, unlike the analog one. Yevgeny told me that he possesses the analog version and it sounds much better than the digital. The digital version was crushed by the terrible sound reduction and the auto-fade functions. Besides the first limited issue, there was also another issue that was released many years later on CDs, but it contained both Bergolim's albums because the Discipline didn't have an official cover. Uh, that's why the slightly altered cover art of the first album was used instead. Musically, the second album was much harsher and more abstract than the previous one. It was noisier and mostly was drone ambient that wasn't accompanied by any kind of vocals. The album wasn't as long as the previous one. What can I say about the Blown Up Bridges Discipline? Just like Zmet album, it's a very interesting album. It sounds very uncompromising, but at the same time quite meditative. I think conceptually it's a very decent Zmet sequel. What happened to the band after that? Did they release anything else? No, unfortunately. The thing is that besides Dargolim, the members had some other stuff to do. Mitya Zubov had his own solo projects and his own life. Roman Sidorov started being in the relationships with Alia, who later he'll marry and with whom he'll depart to Moscow. Unfortunately, Bergolim was over, but the entirely new period in Roman's life just began. Her peers called her Alia, but her full name is Alevtina Kurbanova. On the internet, she became known as Alia Goticheskaya or Alia the Gothic. Roman and Alia had lots of common friends who knew them before they met each other. As I already mentioned before, Roman and Alia first time met each other in 1998 at a Government Alpha concert. Then Roman was 24 and she was 18. After meeting and learning more about each other, they became a couple. They had lots in common with each other. They both were musicians. Alia was a very talented guitarist and she participated in some bands and projects. She enjoyed different kinds of music, but one of her most favorite genres was post-punk. One of the main projects where she played was the band Dыхание, that later will be known as Necrostellar. She played there together with Yuri Zvyzdny, who was mentioned in the chapter 4. Ali belonged to the goth subculture. She was very into different body modifications such as tattoos, piercings, etc. She did it not just for the aesthetics, but she also tried to ideologize and philosophize about it. Once she was invited to one Russian TV show about sex that was called About It, where she told publicly about her body modifications, why she did it, about her views, and about sex. Besides all of that, she told about her ideology that she called the New Primitivism. Its, uh, its idea was based on imitating the cultures of an ancient tribes through pain and body modifications. In the end, the footage was shown in which Alia came to a tattoo salon where the master sews up her mouth. After watching that interview, her parents, who were very rich, gave her an ultimatum. They said to her, "You either quit all of this stuff or we won't financially support you anymore." Eventually, Alia shaved her mohawk haircut off, quit hanging out with her friends, and married Roman. After marriage, Roman and Alia spent their honeymoon in Paris. Flight to Paris made a great impression on Roman. It was the only time when he was abroad. When Roman married Alia, they started living in Moscow together. Very little known what happened during that period because they lived very isolated life then and didn't communicate to their friends at all. According to Evgeny Varanovsky, the last two times he saw him was at the birthday party of their common friend, where Roman didn't do anything and didn't talk to anyone. He just sat and stared at the fireplace. The second time Varanovsky saw him was in the summer of the year 2000. Another their common friend invited both him and Roman to one ethnic music festival. Evgeny wasn't into it, but he agreed to come. Surprisingly, Evgeny and Roman met each other. They already weren't such a good friends and weren't glad to see each other. When they arrived to the place by train, their friend who invited them confused something and they arrived to the wrong station. There was nothing but forest around them. It was already late evening, so they decided to stay there for sleepover. They walked there for some time and unexpectedly found there an abandoned shipwreck. As they tried to reach it, they got surrounded by a huge swarm of locusts. Locusts were everywhere. So the guys ran and tried to defend themselves. Uh, then they finally reached the shipwreck. They decided to stay there. They went out when they went out to swim in the nearby river. As they returned, it was dark, and suddenly, on the shipwreck, there was an open trapdoor in which Roman fell. Everyone got scared because it was pretty deep, and they thought that Roman died there. Fortunately, he didn't. When guys pulled him up, they saw that he had just an abrasion on the back of his head. Then they all sat to eat the porridge that Roman and Evgeny's friend had with him. It was absolutely inedible, but it was the only food they had then. As the sun started rising, they went to the train station. They were dirty and exhausted. They went inside the train, laid on the seats while being surrounded by people who were going to their jobs in the morning. It was the last time Evgeny Varanovsky saw Roman. There is so little of the information on what happened to Roman after. What is known for sure is that Roman and Alia's lifestyle was very unhealthy. Evgeny Solovyov had a chance to visit their apartment, and, and that's what he saw there. The windows were curtained. The only light source was a few candles, and everywhere were remains of cheap fast food such as pizza. Evgeny called it physical and mental negativism. Physical one is when you don't exercise, eat junk food, abuse alcohol and drugs, etc. And the mental one is when you're being isolated, hate everyone and everything. According to Evgeny, Roman and Alia had those both types of negativism that combined in the most destructive way. While living with Alia, Roman did some music together with her. His next project was called Starucha Mha. The title was made by Alia. In the beginning, she wanted to make a post-punk band with the same title, but eventually it was given to one of Roman's projects. Starucha Mha was founded in the year 2000. It's an ethereal, drone and dark ambient project. Between 2001 and 2002, he recorded two albums by the project. It's unknown how he recorded them. Some people claim that he did field recordings himself. Others say he didn't record anything himself but took all samples from the libraries. What Evgeny Solovyov told me by the phone is that anything could be possible during the recording process. It was possible that Roman could take samples from somewhere else because he lived with Alia and she was from a rich family with connections, so she had access to the studios, good equipment, etc. It was also possible that Roman could record everything himself, because if you give him a portable recorder, of course he might go to the forest and take some records. There was one case when Roman ate some shrooms and went to the forest at night. When he got lost, it started raining there, so he was wet. He finally could reach the road. There he encountered his acquaintances in the car who were good people and brought him back home. Among his peers, there were many people who were very deep into different occult stuff and who had a huge influence on Roman. Yuri Zvyzdny, for instance, was one of those people. There are such rumors that sometimes Roman went to forests where he could use some drugs and commit different occult practices. I think it's very clear that Roman could record at least something for Staruha Mha himself, if not everything. Anyway, Roman always worked for the result and had his own unique worldview that he expressed through his music, so the way he did it wasn't as important as the way he wanted it to be. One thing can be said for sure is that the nature and ancient cultures related to it definitely inspired him during the creative process, so there still was lots of human factor in his music. When he finally recorded the albums, he made some copies of them on CDR and distributed them himself. Roman tried to release Staruha Mha's music on label Strely Peruna, Perun's Arrows, that was owned by Andrei Ivanov, at whose apartment Roman recorded their Golem's second album. Unfortunately, Andrei refused to release it on his label because he thought the music was too bright. The first album that Roman made was Agni, or Fires. It was recorded in 2001. The second album was called Rusalii. It was recorded in 2002. Conceptually, both albums have much in common. Firstly, both albums contain the song Deformation, after which one the albums are changing the way they sound. The music also reminds me of the soundtrack from the film Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. I found both Staruha Mha's albums very interesting, but I liked Rusalii more than Fires. Fires was great, but while listening to it, I thought it was very unstable conceptually, unlike Rusalii. I listened to Rusalii twice, in 2019 and 2020. I find this album very special, and it's one of my favorite music albums. I think this album is the best thing that Roman did during his entire music career. I think all of the music he did, except for Bardcore, had a unique and a deep atmosphere, but it's been especially felt on Rusalii album. Well, I think it's time to tell you about the last project where Roman participated, Sedative. Again, very little is known about it. If Staruha Mha was more Roman's project where Alia helped him, Sedative was already her own project where Roman helped her. There, Alia was the guitarist and Roman was the vocalist. Somewhere on the internet you can see the project title with the letter E at the end and without it. It's unclear which version is correct. Sedative was founded in the late 90s, but had a different lineup. If you've heard the song Alia Freak by Fatal, you must know that this song is actually Sedative's song. In 2004, Sedative was revived and already had nothing to do with the previous lineup. Sedative didn't release anything officially. There were only 10 untitled songs that were found by the police on Roman's computer after his death. Those songs appeared on the internet many years later, and then it became known which titles the song's supposed to have. I enjoyed all of those songs while listening to them. Before hearing Rusali album by Staruha Mha, I really thought Sedative was the best Romance project. All of the songs have very melancholic, dreamy and relaxing atmosphere. My favorite song is the song number 10. I often turn it on while waking up in the early morning. During his last years, Roman was especially isolated and depressive. His lifestyle, as I mentioned before, was far from being healthy. Nobody could neither help nor influence him in any way except for Alia, of course. In 2003, his mother took him away from Alia back to Fryazina. When his mother went to the store, Roman went outside and walked in circles around the playground. When his mother returned home, she saw him hanging. Roman Sidorov took his own life in September 20th of 2003. He was 29 years old. Roman was buried in Fryazina at the local graveyard. He lived in Moscow for so long that he became forgotten by many people of Fryazina, except for some of his friends. He was already the stranger in that town. Even his best friend, Mitya Zubov, got kind of disappointed in Roman, because he felt very sad when his best friend stopped hanging out with him after getting married. Some of Roman's friends visited the burial. They were very upset indeed, but many of them weren't surprised that his life ended up in such a tragic way. They attended the funeral, talked to each other for some time, and then went back to their homes. Many of those who knew him and worked with him went their own ways. Some people quit music. Some people continued playing music and even could get an underground success in it. Alia immigrated to London, and it's unknown how she is doing recently. Yevgeny Varanovsky still makes music, mostly under his main project Cisfinitum. He became a professor in the British University on the faculty of the sound design. Yevgeny Solovyov became a DJ. He now plays in theater and still makes music. He also was the member of Varanovsky's project Cisfinitum. Yuri Zvyzdny now plays in his band Necrostellar. What about Mitya Zubov? About him I would like to tell a bit more. After Roman's death, he continued playing music. Mostly he played in his own projects, Zubov Sex Shop and Hypnos. Mitya wasn't a bad person, but he lived a very self-destructive lifestyle. He was financially dependent on his mother, and when his mother got tired of that, she found a room for him. So he moved there. He lived in a bad area, and his neighbors were criminals. He also got a job, but he didn't go there regularly because he preferred to stay at his friends' homes where he could sleep, eat, drink, etc. It made many of his friends avoid him. His relationships with his neighbors were terrible. There were cases when Mitya stole some food from his neighbor's fridge and got beaten up for that. He didn't appear at his apartment since. Mitya also was a heavy drinker. Once he went to St. Petersburg, where he was fed only vodka. When he returned home, he was very sick. Once his mother found him lying next to her home. His organism was extremely exhausted from the alcohol abuse. Mitya was brought to the hospital where doctors said that nothing could help him anymore. He will die. Dmitry Medenkov, aka Mitya Zubov, died in October 25th of 2011 from pneumonia, cirrhosis, and a kidney failure. At his funeral, mostly the family members were present because they didn't have time and money to invite everyone and to organize the ceremony. His family needed to lease their apartment for about 2 months to bury Mitya. Although a few days later, about 20 to 30 people came to the funeral from Moscow. Some of those people lived in Yevgeny Solovyov's place for 3 more days. Mitya Zubov was buried in the same graveyard where Roman Sidorov was. Roman started getting his posthumous recognition after Staruha Mha's both albums were released on the labels Agni Svet and Tantric Harmonies in 2003 and 2004. Evgeny Voronovsky sent them there and he also helped promoting Roman's music. The album and the song titles of Staruha Mha were translated into English. The second album was released in 2003 on Tantric Harmonies, and the first album was released on Agni Svet in 2004. All of that was done without the permission of those people who possessed the rights on Roman's music. Recently, Roman's music doesn't have copyright because it wasn't registered officially, but due to ethics, the rights on his music must belong to his family and the recently alive band members. I'm very proud that Russian music scene had such an incredible artist whose music has influenced so many people, including myself. And I feel very excited for doing the research about his life and music and for telling about him to you guys. I've seen some people claim that he is overrated, but I think this podcast lets you understand that he was an artist who lived an unusual life, who had his own charisma and unique worldview that he expressed through his music. So now it's more than obvious that his recognition in the underground scene was absolutely deserved. And while people remember him and his music, he didn't die, but was just gone.